Second, okay.
You're going to tell me. All right.
Yeah, we're going, so we're good, Wes. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this SCMA Center for Physicians Resources presentation on understanding employment contracts. Tonight I'm going to focus on compensation and benefits. So we're going to keep all lines open so you can ask questions, but if we do pick up a bunch of background noise, just to be courteous to our presenter, I'll go ahead and mute those, but we will offer and open up the lines for opportunities for questions. But I'm going to turn it over to Wes Cleveland. Wes is a attorney with the American Medical Association. I just have to say he has been an excellent resource for us. I mean, there's people who are knowledgeable, people who are consultants, and at the very top of the list, there's guys like Wes. And so do thank him for being with us tonight. So, Wes, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to introduce yourself and say a little more about you, and then lead us through this discussion this evening.
Well, I'd like to get to our presentation. I know it's time is sensitive for you all, and like to be able to reserve some time for questions. I've been an attorney representing real physicians my whole career for about 20 years. Attorney General down in Texas doing health law, and then I worked for the Texas Medical Association as a lawyer, and worked for a while in private practice representing physicians in front of medical boards, things like that, and in transactional matters. And then I've been up at the AMA since 2003. It's a great privilege to represent the docs, so for this opportunity. With that, let's get started here. Okay, so we're talking about compensation. We're going to be just talking in general terms here because compensation methodologies are just going to vary greatly within practices and within health systems. So, I mean, it's kind of a hackneyed phrase, but, you know, when you've seen one compensation arrangement, I've seen one, but there's some general principles that apply I want you to think about, and some issues that you should think about if you're thinking of entering into an employment relationship with a hospital or a private practice or some other kind of setting. So we're focused probably more on the hospital side of things, but is appropriate, and there's something important that needs to be said that applies to private practice and employment in that setting. I'll talk about that as well. So, seeing right now is a significant number of private practices are continuing to use some of what we call the traditional models that private practices have used. Salary with a productivity bonus that historically, let's say years ago maybe, was using RVU methodologies, but maybe like percentage of collections, percentage of net incomes. But we are now seeing physician practices move over to a WRVU methodology. And because practices are moving in that direction, and that's the predominant method that hospitals use to reimburse, to compensate physicians. I'm going to really focus on that methodology. We're seeing a trend now in physician practices using more of a WRVU-based methodology. I think maybe in part because of those national surveys out there that help and benchmark, so forth. The WRVU formulas are really the predominant way in which hospitals pay physicians in terms of setting the compensation, obviously, and then also determining productivity. Those of you who may be going into practice, and I understand that we may have some residents with us who may be considering their first job. This is an attempt to address the previous employment trend when we're hiring docs in the first place. Docs were selling their practices, and hospitals were simply paying the physicians on a salary with activity function. And in some cases, that did not did not sufficiently incentivize physicians to work at the rates that they had when they operated their own practice. So they received that. But I tell you that in the private practice market, we do see some groups that still use a salary. Straight salary is a way of compensating the physicians, probably because they view it as more equal across the board. So I wouldn't say that that's not in popularity, but it's probably, you're probably going to see it in select areas, but it hasn't totally gone out of style. So I think some of the bigger groups may go with straight salary. Now, definite advantages to using our WRVU. So I want to go through some of this. In the WRVU, that's the work component of a particular service or procedure or examination has been assigned by Medicare. It's assigned a value. So ask me more questions about that later. That's fine. But agreed upon. What's good about this is that the formula can be relatively straightforward. Okay, and that's really, really important when it comes to compensation, because I think it's to say that would be one of the most important elements in contract. And when it comes to the methodology by which you're being paid, you don't want there to be any confusion there. In fact, what I tell contract, some transparency, it is a virtue of WRV methodologies, okay? And I will say, I always tell the younger residents that I recommend to them when they're thinking about an employment arrangement and have this compensation methodology of any kind, I would see the employer for an example of how that actually works in a given scenario. So you can see exactly how you might be paid based on your productivity level and so forth. It's a way to flesh it out. It also matches up partially with the way that many managed care organizations pay physicians. They often use an RVS methodology. So that thing is more simple for physicians working in the hospital setting as well as in private practice. I also think that one of the reasons why you have the WRVU system and for why it was created in the first place is it's a favorable means of comparing time, training, skill, intensity. And an advantage in the hospital setting in particular is because the RVU-based methodology is just based on the work itself, is fair, neutral, and unaffected by collection rates. So that can be very helpful if you've got a broad range of payor mix, or you have indigent patients in the hospital setting and so forth. Now, in terms of private practice, the first bullet point, it's good that Medicare has already assigned WRVUs to most of the universe of procedures out there. And there are programs that are also out there that will supplement the Medicare RVUs, because obviously there's going to be services that you would be providing that obviously Medicare is not going to have a number assigned to, because your population obviously may not be Medicare recipients. So there are programs that will fill that gap. Private practice setting, to use WRVUs can be easier than one might think, because most practice management systems track the RVUs that are billed. Okay. And another big advantage, or perceived advantage, of a WRVU methodology is it's a way that the employer can try to find a way to correlate productivity with compensation. And that's kind of how the national surveys are set up, like MGA and so forth. Is becoming more and more important. We'll get into why it's becoming more important. but using the WRVU to calculate expected productivity and value assignments to the work RVUs that you will be providing. You add up with a national survey and employees like hospitals feeling more against pressure to make the amounts that they pay their physicians are within fair market value. So this method helps hospitals link to these national surveys to try to help them appear doing their due diligence with regard to fair market value. Okay, it's a typical way for the employer to develop the RVU-based compensation using the market salaries that are available by specialty and geographic area. You probably know these. I think the ones we hear the most about are MGMA, Medical Management Association, MGMA, and then Sullivan Cotter. I think Sullivan Cotter focuses a little bit more on hospital compensation to physicians. But national surveys, right? But all compensation is going to depend on supply and demand and options that may be available to you as a physician, also to the employer, whether it be a hospital or a private practice. So we know that, some docs will see the national survey data, but then may have an offer that's a little different than that based on local conditions. So just have in mind. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to is that now there is a physician shortage, and it's not to get any better. So you are valued, is what I say first of all. And what I want to say is, if you want market research to figure out what the demand for your services might be, you want to go onto the AMA website here in my second bullet point, where the workforce mapper, you can get on there and see for a particular specialty what the ratio is between the specialist and with respect to the particular patient population. So, for example, went to the who manages that workforce mapper, and we took a look. I think it was in San Francisco. We saw there was a dermatologist for 22,000 people, and then we ran that same kind of search in New Mexico, and it was one dermatologist for every 44,000 patients. So that gives you a sense of what the particular demand in the varying degrees of supply and demand and based on your services might be. So notice, maybe not thinking about this, is to say a plastic surgeon, there's going to be more competition for you if you go to Miami or if you go to Los Angeles, as opposed to going to a place like Austin, Texas, something like that. But I suggest using that workforce mapper, and that might give you a sense of how many patients there are for your particular specialty. Okay. If you're starting out, I've heard a lot of times it's recommended shoot for the median in terms of what those national surveys might be. And then if you're selling a practice, in other words, if you're up and running, right, you've been practicing a while, you're really efficient, what you should do is determine your own productivity with respect to survey information that might be presented to you just by looking at your own billing records. And I would say that if you have been practicing for a while, I would think about hiring your own evaluation consultant. I want to talk to you a little bit about lawyers here, but maybe not for the reasons you might think. And I don't, or the AMA does not get any benefit from saying this about retaining the services of a lawyer. But I just want to make that clear. But lawyer, if you get representation, I suggest you should only can they help you on legal aspects of the contract, but if they've been practicing in the market for quite a long time, and there's been some who've been representing physicians in these issues for many, many years, 30 years, they should know the market. They help you understand what you can or cannot negotiate with a particular employer. And they may know the culture and reputation of the employer in the community. For example, whether there's a lot of turnover in a particular hospital system from docs. And should have a good of the going rate maybe for physicians in your particular specialty. And here's one thing I want to say too, when I go out and talk to residents primarily about compensation matters, I always get asked, well, how do we get our hands on the MGMA data? He said, well, you probably don't want to pay for that because it is very expensive, but it's very likely that the attorney who would be representing you have that survey information. Now, I learned a couple other things. You can get an idea maybe of what a salary range for you is by going on salary.com. I've heard some consultants recommend that. And also, and you may have also heard about this, is you can go to Doximity. I did not know until maybe about the past half year, and possibly get some salary comparables there. And Medscape, that's recently released a 2015 survey on compensation as well. Okay, compensation, there's many, many different ways that you can be compensated. The formulas can be tweaked to represent particular culture, et cetera. I've already talked about that. One thing you want to also think about in private practice, I think, is expenses are going to be allocated. And the goal there is you want them to be allocated fairly. I don't want to probably not go into it too much. But I mean, since you want to ask, are share expenses equally? Are they going to be more based more visibly on percentage of gross and so forth? Ask kinds of questions about how expenses are going to be allocated, because those will be subtracted ultimately as part of determining what your ultimate compensation will be. And questions like, are physicians charged for days out of the office? Are you given or granted time off? Those kinds of questions are very important. Now, ultimately, wherever you're going to be practiced, except in those areas where you're going to be getting paid a flat salary, which is around that much anymore, like I said, except for maybe in some of the larger groups where that's been their culture for a long, long time. Compensation will be based on productivity. With regard to this, you want to make sure that ultimately succeed and make me that compensation arrangement with the productivity component. So the main question you would want to ask yourself in this situation is the productivity goals there that maybe you'd like to hit or your employer would like you to hit, are they achievable? Questions you want to ask here is, let's say PCP, is your employer going to make a sufficient number of patients available to you that you can generate the WRVUs that you want to generate or that the employer wants you to generate? For a specialist, is the employer going to give you does the employer have a sufficient referral base to enable productivity targets? And practicing, particularly if you've been practicing in the community and had a wide referral network, are still going to be able to retain those referral contacts if you move into a good relationship with a hospital. Are you going to, or is your referral network going to be restricted, or are you going to have to use physicians? To what extent will your employer market your services? Because that's going to help you and your productivity, I believe. And the question to kind of flesh this out is to say, well, does the employer have any money allocated to marketing on your behalf? And it's probably for residents who may be getting their first job? To what extent is the employer going to facilitate your introduction to potential referral sources, or are you going to have to kind of go out and hustle some contacts and things like that? I see this as provision of a really a pure productivity model that is included in a model practice employment agreement that the AMA has that you can access. I'll show where that is at the end of the presentation. But you can see this has or graduated compensation scale. The more RVUs that are performed, the money that's made. One I do want to say for the residents on the phone, typically what's given to you is a base salary with the productivity component that gradually phase in. So you might have a base salary the first year with or without, or maybe with or not with a productivity component. But it is, for the newer docs, you've got to get your practice up and running. So, typically what you would really want to see is not a whole lot of productivity obligations made till the third year when your practice is up and running. But, you might ultimately be placed under a productivity compensation model. I can ask this quite a bit when I'm talking to residents. I think run anywhere, typically maybe 1,000, sometimes, but very rarely they might go up to 100,000. But it's also a matter of culture, okay, your employer. So what I want to say is just because you may not be offered a signing bonus doesn't mean that there's anything particularly unusual about that. I remember I was giving a presentation in Minneapolis along with a representative of I think it was a 45-person gastroenterology group, said that as a matter of practice, the group not give any signing bonuses. It's culture there that they say, look, either you want to come work for us or not. So it's their practice, they don't do that. But we do see signing bonuses in the kind of the range that I gave you. Relocation expenses, you will certainly, that the common practice is to review for your expenses in moving to your new employer. Assistance with student loans, that is something that is often part of the compensation package. I remember recently hearing a presentation by I think it was a writer representative maybe with a hospital chain. I think it may have been HCA, and he said that the usual arrangement is to loan payment amounts to $25,000 a year. So always ask about that. That can be put in as part of your student loan. It's going to be the reimbursement for your work RVUs, but now another thing you need to ask yourself, or I'd like you to ask yourself, is what are going to be your administrative duties? You're going to be working on committees. It's particularly important because I think what we see now, some of the value-based payment arrangement models, that there's a committee work about developing protocols, monitoring utilization. So there may be more management if you're involved in, somebody who payment in models like ACOs, bundle payments, and so forth. So there may be a significant obligation there. So have supervisory responsibilities that you need to be compensated for. So the main point here I want you to think of is understand what your, I didn't use the word not clinical, I said non-direct patient care obligations may be, so that understand what they are and then understand how they're going to square them any payment methodology that's based on work reviews, because it turns out that you have to spend all hours a week or 5 hours a week, something like 4 hours a week on administrative duties. Well, that's going to cut away from the time that you're going to be able to provide direct clinical care. So just keep that in mind. That can be an issue. These are typical fringe benefits that you'll be provided with. And I would just say, I don't want to belabor this point. For a surgeon, I get that bullet that talks about accident and disability insurance. You want to X that out in them some, because if something would happen that would make it impossible for you to use your hands, it's difficult for you to level of income up that you might have had before you had the event that may have hindered your ability to perform, etc. On this, I want you to see the last bullet point, professional insurance. A lot of times, depending on who the employer is, but often in employer agreements, what we see simply a paragraph that says insurance, that the employer will be responsible for buying professional liability insurance for the employee, for the physician while he or she is employed with the employer. Sometimes issues of tail aren't brought up at all. So what I suggest, and a lot of consultants suggest, ask the employer about tail coverage, even if it's not addressed in the agreement, and have it addressed. And remember, whenever you're in a contract situation, it make any difference what's said or promised unless it's actually included in the contract. So you need to be in a situation, for example, I remember a conversation I was listening to with a physician lawyer who said, well, the restrictive covenant, but maybe we could get out of the restrictive covenant, but the problem was the physician was going to have difficulty leaving his employment because the tail coverage, he was going to be obligated to pay the tail coverage premiums, and that was a barrier to him leaving. So address so you know what's going on there. So purely with regard to private practice, typically is in practice, the physician employee has an opportunity to buy in practice and become a partner, shareholder, let's say owner, okay, and have more, with it comes more oftentimes more management authority, and then it can, offer more financially rewarding. Usually, the physician employee has 2 to 3 years after starting practice has an opportunity to buy into the practice, okay? I'll just say here, and what's generally recommended is make sure that you enter into the employment arrangement, you understand very clearly in price and the terms of becoming an owner. This should be very clear up front. I remember when I was in private practice, see sometimes employment agreements from into practices, and it would describe the buying opportunity would be very general, very difficult to understand, and the situation you don't want to be in if you're thinking about being employed by a physician practice. You don't want to work there for 2 years and then have different expectations about being an owner than what the owners may have and what your buying opportunities have been will be. Traditionally, physicians have opted for lower compensation in return for a lower buy-in amount. Okay. But the thought I would say is push your employer for this, especially if it's a smaller practice. Sometimes smaller practice may sometimes more informal on this, but you want to make sure that your work is being viewed with the practice at least annually. So how you're doing with the practice, and understand if you're on the right track and you're on the page with your employer in terms of buy-in. About WRVU methodologies generally. Now we're seeing, you probably know, more movement to performance-based compensation. From this slide, Medicare wants to move in that direction. Solar says it's seeing that movement in the organizations that it's surveyed. It says on average, quality incentives make up 6% of total cash compensation. We're just going to see that trend move more and more in that direction. Okay, performance with respect to what? So those are the kind of the things we're seeing. Adherence to quality process measures. For those who may not be following this, especially residents whose practices have been so regimented up to this point, process measure is just, did you provide a docs? Did you give a? Let me state it correctly here. How did you give a patient who's having a heart attack an aspirin or something to deal, some medication to deal immediately with symptoms of the heart attack, if I've said that right? And if the physician does that 90% of the time, then that would be financially rewarded. So that's a process measure. Also, adherence to outcome measures. For example, readmission rates to the hospital, leading hospital stay, and so forth. That's an example of an outcome measure. Metrics, I've seen some of these in employment arrangement. Physicians are rewarded if they prescribe maybe 50% from a generic formulary. Goods and ship requirement, we see that now attending meetings. Patient satisfaction is a big, now you may know that from HCAHPS. Even work completion is a metric. So these examples, if you look at them, what compensation based on performance could like in terms of quality. And these are taken from the physician employment contract I talked to you about. But, I do want to say that one thing you should always think about is the extent. You see here we have employees' total compensation. The first bullet point says employee shall be entitled to a bonus equal of blank percent of employees' total compensation. Employee scores 80% or more in at least 3 PQRS measures. At least are confident that measures used to determine your performance are ones that are actually relevant. Keep in mind, also we will see a certain amount of compensation based on the quality of responses to physician satisfaction surveys, again, in the hospital setting, like apps. Okay, value-based purchasing, we're talking about things like bundled payments, performance. You may have heard of ACOs, the Medicare Shared Savings Program. The thought to be thinking about this in the area is there going to be accurate risk adjustment? In other words, how your employer, let's say, if you're not getting the quality outcomes that my peers have been, but you also care of a disproportionate number of patients that cases, employer going to differentiate that so that you're penalized for having a sicker patient load, or maybe in cases that nobody else wants? That's an important question. Let's see. Patient and episode attribution methodologies can be complex. I think you want to know what you are going to be responsible for. So if you are asked to participate in performance-based compensation, how are costs and care attributed to you? With the bundled payments, what are the episodes of care and the services that are included? How will the profits and losses be split up between participants? So say you're in a bundled payment arrangement, where a lump sum might be paid to a hospital and the physicians participating in it. How is the hospital going to apportion that between itself and physicians? Now, this is the last part of the presentation, and it has to do with fair market value. I think this is becoming more and more of an issue, not just because really a trend now seen for more enforcement, more liability exposure for hospitals in particular paying physicians that's higher than fair market value. But I think what physicians are also seeing is in their negotiations with hospitals. I think now a lot of discussion with hospital representatives that there's on what they can pay now because of fair market value concerns. In fact, I think I was with the House of Delegates, and we've seen some solutions come up that the AMA address situations where there may be a concern that about fair market value might be not used appropriately and used as a negotiating tool to reduce physician reimbursement below what it actually should be, if that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense, ask me a question about it later. Okay, so we're talking about fair market value. So like my first bullet point here said there may be pressure to place limits on compensation because of increasing fraud and abuse concerns focusing on payments to employed physicians. We have laws that are important here, the anti-kickback statute, the STAR law, the Internal Revenue Code, Internal Review Code, it's Internal Revenue Code, sorry about that. Increasing trend now, which is probably the most disturbing thing, with whistleblowers alleging violations of federal law because employee physician compensation didn't reflect fair market value. We're seeing most of the action under the Stark Law. There's Stark Law for where an employer compensates an employee physician like a hospital, employed physician. However, that compensation can't exceed fair market value. In excess of fair market value can create a question concerning why are you paying the physician more than fair market value? It leads to an inference that it may be in exchange for a referral. That is in violation of the Stark statute. So the determination of fair market value can't take mandated referrals into account. So this is interesting because many considered it unlikely that physician employment arrangements would be subject to enforcement because that exception existed. I already talked to you, there's been certain whistleblower actions that have come forward based on allegations, compensation between the hospital and the physician of Stark Law. Like I said before, it's either not fair market value or it takes into the volume or value of referrals. So, it's under the legalese, but another statute called the False Claims Act, and it has a whistleblower provision. So what happens is that there may be someone who works for a hospital who may go to management and say, hey, I think we may be paying the docs too much, or maybe the formula they're using take into account the value or volume of referrals somehow, something like that. Her concerns aren't addressed. Well, could, under this False Claims Act, a private lawsuit for violation of the Stark statute. And then sometimes the government gets involved in it. When that does, then there's usually doesn't go very well for hospital in this situation. Now, this is a very recent trend, and then kind of really in these kinds of cases. The one that's got here is just for illustrative purposes, so you can see, have some context as to why you might be hearing about gaps or limits on compensation due to fair market value concerns. Okay, so we have this Drakeford case, example, but to kind of give you some context. In litigation for 10 years, 2 different trials, Toomey's in South Carolina, a nonprofit hospital in a medically underserved area. What happened is here that the Toomey Hospital had physicians on staff, and they were performing outpatient surgery at Toomey, but then doing so at their offices or locations. So the hospital is concerned about losing that business, the facilities. So entered into a part-time employment agreement with 19 of those physicians. See that the first bullet point talks about what was physicians paid a productivity bonus to their collections. Their salary was adjusted year to year depending on how much the hospital collected, and it did an 80% bonus of collections. So able to incentive bonus up to 7% of that. The docs were working part-time, but also their health insurance covered and the medical liability covered well. And there were also unusual aspects of the contracts, restricted covenants of 10 years. Terms of 10 years and restricted covenants of 2 years within a 30-mile radius that locked in referrals. What happened here, and this is going to make to you regarding whistleblower statutes, the whistleblower cases, is this deal was offered to Dr. Drakeford, but he acted it because he thought it violated the Stark Law. So he accepted that deal, and then he went to the government as a whistleblower. Sometimes what you have is you have insiders, maybe compliance officers, doctors who weren't included in the deal, that if they see their colleagues or if they see an employee compensation, whatever it is, too good to be true, then they're typically the ones that go to the government. You can see, on one thing too, that the hospital did get fair market valuations by independent parties, but I don't want to go into here just because the details of it would take too long. The government was really undermined the credibility of those fair market valuations. So when the jury delivered a $257 million judgment because it thought that the hospital really was physicians above market value, which was in exchange for referrals. So the one I do want to bring your attention to is in terms of caps. Something here about caps. Initiations of the hospital employers may say, we cannot pay you more than X. Another way, if you might have the policy of responding and say, hey, I'll agree to a cap, but how about a hit a cap instead of a hard cap that we can't ever go over? Why don't I review my services then to see adjust that. So that would be something called like a soft cap. And the resources at the AMA, hospital practice, hospital and group practice model employment agreements. You can take a look at some of the provisions and points made in this presentation come from that. So that's the presentation. I think with a little bit of time for questions, I'll be glad to handle those. So, Mark, you can take it over and direct any questions we might have.
I'm going to go ahead and open up all lines at this time. Please encourage anybody you have questions for Wes to please go ahead and ask. So at this point in time, the phone lines are open. If there's any questions, please do so. Double check to confirm they are open. It appears they are. So again, if you have any questions for Wes, please ask. There is one question I do have that I would like to ask you, and this is a little different than what we've been talking about this evening. We've talked a lot about compensation, talked about bonuses and incentive programs. The thing that comes to my mind is when admissions are denied, is there anything in the contract that a person should be looking at to provide some protection there?
Admissions are denied?
Right, like so if somebody is employed by a hospital or the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services come through, CMS comes through, and have their RAC audit contractor that does an audit, and then they end up charging back the amount of dollars for procedures or things of that nature. Have you ever seen that to be an issue?
I've heard about that from time to time. Especially, I can see what you're saying because a lot of that might be administered by the hospital. You don't want to be in a situation where a doc is going to be 100% responsible for that back. So I think I've heard about it. The only way I've heard that up to this point of how physicians may have had to protect themselves is maybe including an indemnity provision in their employment agreement that would address instances of, much risk of loss or occurrence of loss for something like that and transferred solely to the physician, or how that's apportioned. Or maybe the physician's in a strong position might be able to have that complete protection from that kind of occurrence included in the agreement. But I say that has been addressed or through these submitted language.
Thank you. Once again, phone lines are open. Any questions for Wes, please ask you to do so at this time.
This is Rob Allison in Pierre. Hi, Wes. How are you?
Thank you for your question.
I was at the AMA National meeting at Chicago, and we're looking at some of the new models. And I was also at the ACP National meeting in Washington, D.C., where they were talking a little bit about new CMS models for payment for cognitive therapy or cognitive work in addition to fee for service. This question would be, can you give any insight into any organizations that are promoting a fee service plus a cognitive model for the complexity of patients? And then I'll follow-up question after that.
Yes, sir. I don't know off the top of my head on that. That
okay.
I could check with our D.C. office or maybe with some of our psychiatric colleagues, but you probably have access to that. But off the top of my head, no.
This deals with affordable care organizations, ACOs, and joint savings. Some of them was at the AMA National meeting in Chicago. Single practice groups like oncology, where savings were made in an organization that physicians shared some of that savings and reimbursement based on the process. In other words, if they decrease drug costs, prevent readmissions, etc., then the physicians were compensated. it's an interesting model to argue that as me, a primary care internist in Pierce, South Dakota, how do you value your benefit for an ACO by preventing admissions, by keeping people healthy in an outpatient status? How do you argue that in a physician compensation contract?
That's a great question. To what extent do you have in practice, how big is your practice?
In Pierce, a multi-specialty group, probably 35 physicians in town. 4 internal medicine providers are the main source, and then 4 primary family practice. So the primary care aspect is around 8. We have 2 pediatricians and then physician assistants in the group as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. To the extent, the leg up, if you have a sense of, if you track quality, and I mean, maybe some physician practices do, others aren't as far along with that, but you can track your quality with regard to the admits, if you have sufficient information exchange with a hospital, or if you have a sense of how you might be doing with regard to certain process measures, and use that kind of information as an initial negotiating point if you want to enter into an ACO. That's probably your starting point.
And it's a difficulty because the data is in the detail, and that's with the employer trying to figure out, how to interpret that data while practicing medicine. It's very difficult, especially when a lot of these contracts each year and renewed, and discussion may or may not bring up the concept of shared value and or are you meeting metrics as much as how do you participate in that. So I think as a private practitioner or as I'm a system physician, getting that information and using it in your practice to make good decisions and make a fair argument for the employer and the employee, that's where it gets to be quite difficult.
Yeah, I think now that I think of it, I think there may be another route you could go. You could say, you could approach, I guess, a hospital, right? If you're talking about, I guess there are ACOs that are completely physician-sponsored, but let's just say you've got one that also has a hospital included with it. What you could do, or you might enter an ACO type arrangement with, with a health insurer, or maybe as part as a centered medical home, something like that. What you could do is, even if you don't have that data, you could approach whoever's managing that or doing contracts and say you want to be included. They give the metrics, and then I think what you would want to do is make that like the ACO program has. I think what you'd want to do is have a term contract that might be 3 years, okay, so that not used to doing it, and you have, the year, second year, and third, you might be seeing some positive results, right? You might see reduction in admissions, so that you have that initial term that you won't get evergreened after the first year, and then they'll say, oh, we don't see any improvement, you're out. Right? Have, maybe a 3-year, I've seen 3-year terms, I've seen them up to 5 years. And then some protection, at least the initial term, where you would not have any responsibility, financial responsibility for any loss. So it would just be upside. But if you're new to the game, you're going to need information. You'll probably need some technical support, right? And a good partner with that respect. But then, like you brought up very well, you want to have that initial term long enough that you can have an opportunity to show that you really are invested in the goals that what the payer wants you to hit. So I would think that you might want to do it that. And a lot of physicians are in that situation as well. You know, I don't know if this helps you, but you could always email me because I do know a thought leader who with a doc who is head of a state medical society, but also run a what do you call them, a patient-centered medical home with all these elements, and he seems to be doing pretty well. So I'll be glad to put you in touch with he works at his organization in an ACO. He runs I think he runs a patient-centered medical home as part of an ACO, but he had some success with those metrics and stuff. So send me an email if you want to, and I could probably connect you with them.
Thank you. Any other questions for Wes? Hearing none, Wes, I know you've always been very kind that if any questions come up after the fact that members can contact you, that offer still stands?
Of course.
Absolutely. So thank you for that. If anybody does have questions following tonight's presentation, they can certainly contact the Medical Association office, and we can forward those to Wes if you don't have his contact information. Wes, any other things you want to cover this evening?
That's it. And then, you know, if you want to know more about value-based payment, we have some resources on that. And also just think of the last slide there that we do have these very extensive guidance documents that have model language and discuss issues in great detail, maybe even too much for some of you. But those are available then on the AMA website. You can also call me if you discuss some issues further and need some direction to the AMA website, which can be intimidating from time to time.
One comment on my personal experience. I have used that Mapper software, and it's very handy, it's very informative, and it's very straightforward and easy to use. So
good. And remember, you have great value with you, so that may be one of the biggest takeaways. Thank you for that. And if anybody has trouble with that workforce mapper, you know, get into it with me.
In closing, Wes, I certainly want to thank you for taking time to be with us this evening. This second time you've worked with us on a presentation, and both of them have been very informative. I'll make two notes here. Our next presentation is in this series that we've been working on, physician employment issues, is for Tuesday, October 4th, 2016, and that program will focus on the termination of an employment contract. And so I know that's going to be a good program. We have another program coming up September 13th at 7 p.m. That program is going to be on physician resiliency and healing the healer. And so the last thing I need to know before we draw to a close is that they're interested in the Category 1 CME credits for taking part in this program. Once that you back out of the program, you'll be taken to a website with a medical school, and it'll take you right to where you need to complete the information for that. And so if another party comments or questions for Wes, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you, and I wish you a good evening.
Thanks.